Welcome, folks, to a new little series I'm gonna be trying here on this here channel, where we're gonna be having a nice, simple dispelling of small critiques on games that I had played in the last few months or so that I thought were interesting to warrant said critiques. As you'll undoubtedly learn, this will include anything from titles of old to anything new, just something that piqued my interest. But keep in mind, these aren't meant to be full-length critiques, just some extended thoughts on these games. I am hoping this will have a little bit more longevity than some of the other series that we've had here on this show in the past, but as I said before, we'll see how things go. So with expectations set and Murphy's Law in the back of our heads, let's dish out some crazy thoughts. What? I like the title. Can you think of anything better? So a few years ago, the Resident Evil 2 remake completely broke my disinterest in this long-running survival horror series. I had only played 4 and the 3DS version of Revelations up to that point, but this game was so excellently paced and finely tuned that I could not get enough of it. It is the only game in the longest time that I replayed immediately upon beating it. Since then, I have played more games in the series, the most recent one being Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. And while I certainly appreciated its take on the endless survival horror games that were released in the 2010s, it was just a little bit too slow for my taste, although things did pick up by the end. Oh, and the DLC was really good. You get to play as an old man and beat the shit out of monsters. Who doesn't love that? Suffice to say, I was very excited for the next game in the series, Village, because it looked like it was going to be dipping its toes in the RE4 style combat and campier style of that game, while still maintaining the first-person perspective of Biohazard. I got the version for my brand new spankin' PS5. Came with a separate steelbook case as well. I don't know why, it just did. So, with all that build-up and a little demo that I played, as well as Tall Lady, how did RE Village hold up? Pretty well, I would say. What I didn't realize when going into this game was that this year is the 25th anniversary of the Resident Evil franchise. And that is fucking scary because I remember reading about the 15th anniversary game they put out that year, Resident Evil Mercenaries for the 3DS. I mean, I know Revelations was supposed to be the 15th anniversary one, but that got delayed, so sorry. Anyway, it seemed like Capcom took this opportunity to make this a celebration of sorts for the series, going through all sorts of horror styles that the series has tackled in one form or another. Sounds like it would be a big, big, big mess, but I think the game managed to pull together all of those elements into something very cohesive and fun while still maintaining its own identity. The introduction is a bit rough with that, as the enemy count has subsequently increased, and you start with less than enough means to get past them, but as the game goes on, it gets progressively easier. But again, it was still a lot of fun, and this horror variety hour approach the game is taking has led to some of the creepiest shit that the series has ever done. For those who have played it, y'all know what I'm talking about. I also appreciated the return of a merchant-type character, one who would provide a wealth of upgrades and knickknacks to give me plenty of motivation to explore every nook and cranny of this thing. Because as is the case with my favorite RE games, I was mostly engrossed with the exploration, and Village does not disappoint on that front. Story-wise, well, I don't think it's that big a hot take to say that RE has never been that great with storytelling, but I enjoyed what was here. I do think the mishmash of horror tropes and characters fitting those tropes results in a very unstable tone, and the notes scattered throughout the game did a lot of the heavy lifting, fleshing out the history of this village. But it has a solid cast, and I thought it started and ended quite well. It even made me feel sympathetic towards Ethan, despite him not having a face. Again, what helps in that regard is, as per usual, The game looks fantastic, especially on the PS5. My god, the amount of detail in this thing is staggering, and I love the look of each and every locale in this game, even the factory. Also, that Stories Children intro, that was a great touch. The sound design is as top-notch as ever, too, but I was particularly struck by some of the performances in this game. Jesus Christ. Like, these folk right here, they do an excellent job. This is some of the best stuff I've heard all year. Overall, yeah, I think Village is a grand old time. I even like it more than 7. It doesn't quite reach RE2 make or 4 levels for me, because I think the over-the-shoulder perspective worked better for combat, and while I did love exploring this world, with it being so large and the item placement being as haphazardly placed as usual, the backtracking got more than a little annoying. Regardless, this is definitely one of my favorite games that I've played this year. I certainly can't wait for the DLC where Chris punches a boulder. Can you think of anything better? So I know there were quite a few people disappointed in that February Nintendo Direct. The most recent one, though? Holy shit, that was great. Did you see that? But in regards to this one, I thought it was fine. I mean, I can definitely see why some people weren't fond of it, though. That said, I would like to think that we can all agree that the Famicom Detective Club remake announcement was an absolute highlight. Even if you have no interest in this thing whatsoever. If you're a Nintendo fan, just the idea of a remake for two of the only adventure visual novel games Nintendo has ever made, one's written by Yoshio Sakamoto of Metroid fame in his prime, not to mention how it would finally come out in the West for the first time ever, more than 3 decades after their original release, is simply incredible. Now, as someone who is interested in these types of games, we have to take into consideration that Mages was being tasked to produce this project, the people responsible for the Science Adventure series. You know, Steins Gate's Chaos Child Robotics Notes, which both of its games were released in Western territories for the first time ever just this past October, and were great. Well, I mean, Dash was a bit of a crapshoot, but it was still kind of fun. Regardless, that made both of these games an instant buy for me. 3 months later, both games arrived on the Nintendo eShop, and I immediately went through them, and yep, they're pretty good. I'm very satisfied with them. Since I went through the games in release order, we'll talk about them in that manner. First up, there's The Missing Heir, which features the named-by-the-player protagonist tasked to solve the mysterious death of the wealthy and aged head of the Ayashiro family, as well as deal with the sudden amnesia they were inflicted with upon the start of the game. Sounds like a very standard mystery with a very standard plot device, but as is normally the case with games like these, the story evolves and expands well beyond the introduction. And I gotta say, 3 decades later, this story holds up incredibly well. It helps that there weren't any modern concessions made to the story, like these fellas aren't on their smartphones eating hot chip and lie, if you get my drift. And it actually does help that our protag is an amnesiac, as we learn as they learn. I was still able to telegraph some of the later twists, but I found this to be an emotionally compelling tale. Perhaps my favorite aspect, though, would have to be the assistant character that you get, Ayumi Tachibana. I should clarify, though, her role here is only relegated to gathering intel elsewhere from us, and we only speak with her back at the detective office at the end of each day. But I really like that loop of going out and finding all this evidence and then coming back to discuss what each other found throughout the day. It served as a nice, comforting respite from all the drama of the story. And she's just a lovely character in general. Like, it's not really that hard to see why she's so beloved. If you want her to play a more active role in the story, though, The Girl Who Stands Behind will likely be your cup of tea. As this sequel is counterintuitively a prequel, chronicling our nameless protag meeting the fair maiden for the first time, as well as his detective, guardian, man-person of sorts, as they solve a mystery of the murder of one of her closest friends. Much like The Missing Heir, things start out quite simple and then get much more complicated as the story moves along, although not quite to the same extent that one did, and frankly I found this to be a lot less compelling overall too. Don't get me wrong, it's a solid mystery, and I do appreciate Ayumi getting more to do here. It even gets a little mischievous at points, but it felt more fragmented and jumbled, especially with it all being framed around an age-old ghost story. And while the climax and ending of the story is all well and good on its own, they had one tiny little detail after the credits that felt so needless and schmaltzy. I don't usually mind this kind of stuff when I see it, but this one just did not gel with me at all. I also think the localization is much rougher here too, and not to the extent of, say, Life Science Surgical Unit or that first Jake Hunter game that was put out in the West, but far from a top-tier Access or Exceed level effort. You can argue with me all day on this, but I still think The Girl Who Stands Behind is awkward as hell. 'Cause, you know, she stands behind. Who? What? Where? When? Why? I don't know, just ask the writer. Ask good old Yoshio, the man with one of the best track records in writing. That is far from the biggest issue that I have with both of these games, though. Because, let me reiterate, the team was very faithful in creating these remakes. And that includes gameplay as well. That consists of running through a series of menu options to speak with witnesses, examine objects, move to different locations, essentially the standard adventure game format. The problem is that both of these games have a very nasty habit of preventing any further progress until you do one very specific action, and that often leads to rummaging through the menu to choose each and every option until something works. Even with the addition of new options being highlighted when they get added to the menu, the process is still very tedious, so if you're not up for that kind of repetition, I'd recommend cracking open a guide before going through this. I managed to get through them both without one, but I'm not going to shame anybody who does. At least the presentational upgrades made to both games are quite great. The new voice acting is spectacular, and I love that they imbued this thing with the wonderful Mage's art style. I do wish they had an option to switch to the 8-bit graphics, or even just a standalone version of those games, fully localized, but I mean, they kind of do that anyway with the music, so you win some, you lose some. Overall, while I'm sure most will merely appreciate these remakes rather than actually play them, if you like adventure games or visual novels of any kind, this is an absolute no-brainer. So long as you're willing to put up with the archaic progression mechanics. Now they just need to somehow get that satellite view game localized, and I can die happy. I have been slowly going through the Need for Speed series for quite a while now. Even though with the more entries I play, I wouldn't consider myself a fan. The original Need for Speed Most Wanted is one of my favorite racing games of all time, and I do like Criterion's efforts, but as for the rest of the games I've played, well, just to put it lightly, they've been underwhelming. More so when I checked out the Burnout series, and that shit just blew everything out of the water. Like, goddamn. Takedown for life, baby. I was hoping this losing streak would end, though, with the next game that I put on the Need for Speed docket, that being Need for Speed The Run. This would be EA Black Box's last entry in the Need for Speed franchise, and I had no reason to believe that this wouldn't be a complete disappointment. I mean, the concept of an illegal cross-country speed race is loaded with potential. At the very least, it didn't feel like it was going to be another Need for Speed Most Wanted rehash, so if all I could get out of this was some fun arcadey driving, I would be perfectly happy. So, how did this 300-kilometer journey pan out? Well, I did get what I wanted, but I'm not that happy. So, the titular run consists of a series of linear race events taking place across some impressive-looking areas throughout the good old US of A, mostly involving speeding past a certain amount of fellow racers, or reaching all the checkpoints before time runs out, or dealing with cops, disgruntled opponents, etc., etc. We've been here before. There are also some set pieces, curved straight from fucking Split Second or MotorStorm, as well as a leveling system that was kind of like the one in Hot Pursuit, the Criterion one, not the original. I mean, although it's not really that involving, you just win the races, get higher level, unlock cars, it's whatever. As for the racing itself, it's not the greatest. The controls felt stiffer than they have in the past, and I do not care for how the car takes up the majority of the screen during races, even on the furthest camera setting. And I really don't like how if you veer off course ever so slightly, the game will just pause for a moment and then plop you right back into the race like nothing even happened. It's really annoying. Yeah, I know it's a quick reset, but those things interrupt the race every goddamn time and it just kills the momentum. However, they are still mostly fun and provide a decent challenge, something I managed to get even more out of with this challenge series, which is a list of events without the whole run structure, and yeah, I found it a lot more fun. So, gameplay-wise, yes, the run barely succeeds, and everything else is a waste of time, especially the story. Now, I wasn't expecting a Martin Scorsese level of mastery here. It's just about some prick who's running from the mob and has to pay off a massive debt. And he's competing in this race to do so, and a bunch of people are after him, and yeah, that's about as much as you get. From there, though, you would think that he'd meet a bunch of characters along the way, or we would even learn more about his past and struggles beyond how his dumbass got in deep with the goddamn mafia, but nope. It is a very perfunctory tale where things happen and other things happen, and there's no personality on display whatsoever. Not on the villains, not on our fellow racers, not on our partner, and certainly not on our protag. I would recommend just skipping every single cutscene to get to the races, but someone had the bright idea to insert the most annoying character of all into these scenes: quick time events. You gotta remember, this was 2011, where practically every AAA studio was doing this, no matter how contrived, and it would make sense if this were an action game of sorts, like Uncharted, or Batman Arkham Asylum, or Arkham City, but it's a fucking racing game. And you know what the best part is? It's the first thing that you do when you start this thing. I was so baffled when it first showed up. I just had to set the controller down and take a breather. I know EA are more than beneath this kind of thing, but I just could not believe what I was seeing. So yeah, this was another dud from Black Box, and a bit of a whimper to go out on before they got dissolved. Turns out that Most Wanted was their peak after all. We'll see if the other 6th-gen Need for Speed games change that, and if any of the future ones are any good whatsoever. I'm really hoping that Heat is at least somewhat better than this, but yeah, once again, I was very underwhelmed. I have yet to really dig deep into the meat of pure visual novels, despite having played a lot of games in the genre throughout my gaming career. I didn't realize until going through Robotics Notes last year that all of the other VNs I've played, Ace Attorney, Zero Escape, Hotel Dusk, Jake Hunter, Murder by Numbers, Danganronpa, have all been hybrids with another genre in some form or another. Adventure, puzzle, Picross, and now with Valhalla Cyberpunk Bartender action, we have gardening. This little independent title was developed by Sukaban Games and was originally a Game Jam prototype that was expanded into a full game a few years later. You play as a bartender named Jill who works in a rundown dive bar named Valhalla within a very standard cyberpunk dystopian town, Glitch City, and it chronicles her encounters with a variety of citizens finding themselves wandering into the place. For as long as it's been out, I have never quite found the time or interest for this game, but I was gifted it through Steam a little bit ago, so I thought, why not? Let's see what the Westerners can bring to the VNs. And I'm very glad I did go through it. This was a pleasant surprise. First of all, the structure is a fantastic example of finding complexity within simplicity, as a lot of the story is divulged from the day-by-day conversations with the bar patrons and co-workers, as any standard bartender would likely experience, and I was very impressed with the way these devs managed to build some good world building without actually showing a lot of that world, because we are in that bar for the majority of the game. Not to mention that said conversations are loaded with great dialogue and do an excellent job of fleshing out these characters and their motivations. The aesthetics are also on fucking point. I loved the synth-heavy electronic soundtrack. So many great beats on that thing. I'm very tempted to get that goddamn 5-vinyl set. And for as overused as pixelated art is in the indie scene, I really love this style. It does a lot to make it stand out among those other art styles. However, it wouldn't be much of a bartender action game without some bartending action, so you'll be making a shit ton of drinks between these discussions. You take these folks' orders and then go through the recipe book to find the specific drink they asked for, and then you put the thing together. By itself, it's not very interesting. They make for a good breather between conversations, but they remain relatively static throughout the game with only a few variations here and there. That said, the challenge eventually comes in discerning the more vague types of orders, as well as not necessarily making the drink that these patrons are specifically asking for. A mechanic that, as the game itself points out, leads to a non-linear storytelling experience. Couple this with how you're supposed to make sure Jill has enough dough by the end of certain days in order to not get evicted, while also needing to buy certain stuff for her so that her mind is distraction-free. That could make for one hell of a paranoid time. In doing my research though, as is the case for a lot of these kinds of games, it's not actually that non-linear. Yes, there are a few additional character endings one could get through making certain drinks and such, but the core story remains the same throughout, which is good because it's the most compelling thing about it. Jill is an excellent protagonist. So yeah, I'm surprised at how much I like this thing. It's one of those games I reflect on more fondly the more I think about it. It did end a lot sooner than I thought it was going to, but then I had to remember these folks don't have the backing of a major publisher, so of course it was going to end a lot sooner than I thought it did. So just keep that in mind if you decide to go through it yourself. And I recommend you do. Again, it's a really good game, and I cannot wait for that sequel that is in development hell. I hope to God it sees the light of day. Now, if you excuse me, I have to keep myself from buying that fucking vinyl. Last year, I declared Doom Eternal to be my favorite game of 2020. Of the games that I played that came out in 2020. It wasn't my favorite overall, and it had its annoyances, but it was an absolutely joyous experience. It did a great job at maintaining the frenetic action of Doom 2016, while upping the stakes a bit by injecting a bit of strategy into the shooting, and of course by looking and sounding as great as ever. Since then, there have been 2 DLC episodes released onto the masses, going under the name of The Ancient Gods, first part being released back in October, and the second just a few months ago. I wanted to wait until both parts were out so I could just go through them in succession, and was expecting some more fun Doom Eternal action, and all in all, that's what I got. As well as a few broken keyboards and mouse. So, that first part, I was aware of its notoriety beforehand, how it was 50 times harder than anything in the main campaign, even on lower difficulties, and for a while I didn't quite get that vibe. Oh, it was difficult, but so was the main game. Even that goddamn Marauder wasn't kicking my ass like it normally was, because they had the foresight to keep those fights one-on-one and not put it among 50 other enemy types. However, as soon as they introduced the Spirit in the second level, I suddenly realized what y'all were talking about. Because now we have an enemy that can only be defeated with one kind of weapon. Before then, you could defeat any enemy with any weapon type. Some were better at it than others were, and some enemies required specific timing or maneuvering around to do any harm whatsoever, but any weapon would do. Now we have this guy who empowers any foe they get their hands on, and then after said enemy gets ripped apart, you need to quickly switch to the plasma weapon and use the Ghostbusters beam to finish the spirit off. So yeah, that dude and the Bloodmaker were doing a hell of a job annoying the fuck out of me during the second half of the first part. And then there are the bosses. I mean, that cube guy is fine, whatever, he's manageable, but who thought that final boss was a good idea? Other than that, though, it was pretty much the same stuff, just a little bit more frustrating this time around. So with that, how was the second part? Well, it's a lot more forgiving by comparison. It's still hard as balls, and they introduced even more enemies that require specific weaponry to kill, but nothing as annoying as the spirit was, and they used that thing sparingly here. I wasn't too big a fan of the more gimmicky portions, mainly the ones involving the Ghost Wolf trials, if that's what we'll call them. But I do like that we go back to Earth and eventually Hell to meet that Dark Lord dude, whose boss fight was actually pretty kick-ass. In fact, it was so kick-ass, I was able to forgive it for betraying me earlier. At the very least, there aren't a bajillion pillars that are blocking your shot and ruining the momentum of the fight. So yeah, a little bit better than the first part, and overall, both were good additions to the Doom Eternal legacy. And if you disagree with my thoughts on the difficulty and think I just need to get good, you can go I will respectfully take your advice. I'm very interested to see what id are going to do next with this thing. I have no idea what they'll be doing, or even if they'll be doing it, but until then, we can try conquering that Ultra Nightmare mode. No. So there's a new Mario Golf game out. I was excited for it. Toadstool Tour on the GameCube is one of my favorite games ever, and World Tour on the 3DS was fucking great. Camelot really know their golf games. Or at the very least, they haven't disappointed us like they have with tennis. We'll see if that changes, but what better way of celebrating their grand return to the green by going through their very first crack at it? Yes, I am talking about the original Hot Shots Golf for the PS1. And yes, this was them, in case you forgot. Yes, Clap Hands took over the series with the second entry, but I was still very curious to see what this has to offer now. Would it age very poorly, or offer more of the simplified, fun, arcadey approach to golf that these guys have excelled at? Or more blatantly, was it just going to be Mario Golf before there was a Mario Golf? And so I played it, and yep, it is definitely Mario Golf before Mario Golf. It has a handful of relatively similar but well-designed courses, a bunch of fun characters for us to unlock, and some good old-fashioned golfing with the classic 3-button press golf meter. It may not be as deep as those EA Sports titles or even the Golden Tee Golf series, but I had a lot of fun with this. Well, holy shit did it kick my ass. If I was even off by a smidge with the power meter, that ball was not going to end up anywhere close to where I wanted to hit it. Perhaps a standard for any golf game, but this thing has no mercy. It demands accuracy or else you're going to be screwed. But I'll admit, mostly came down to me, and if I felt a session wasn't going well, I was just going to go ahead and restart it. The problem with that is there's no easy way to restart a game. I had to do that by just manually turning off the PS1 and then turning it back on again. And it was only after playing that I discovered there's a button combination with the controller that will just soft reset the game. Even then I had to sit through a few loading screens before I could get back to any of the golfing, so yeah, this wasn't helping with my growing frustration with it. Top it off with how, in order to unlock courses and more character challenges, there's an RPG-like system that has you replay a lot of the courses over and over and over again to get XP, rather than just doing that by winning tournaments like how it was in Toadstool Tour. I hit a massive brick wall and quit. So yeah, it was a pretty good game overall, would highly recommend. What a twist. We are ending this off with the begun. As I stated previously, I like me some VNs. I especially like me some Ace Attorney and Zero Escape. Now, what would happen if someone were wacky enough to put the two together, huh? Right, anyway, Danganronpa, or Danganronpa, however the fuck you want to pronounce it. I was very interested in this series for the longest time, ever since its initial release in the Americas on the PS Vita. And yeah, that's kind of what kept me from getting into it. I know it eventually got into PC like a year later, but by then my school life and other games were keeping me occupied pretty well, so it just kind of fell in between the cracks. However, in the summer of last year, after having the game gifted to me once again through Steam, I decided it was finally time to take a look at this monstrous franchise. And yeah, it is a fucking ride and a half. I have no idea why I haven't already gone through this thing. Let me just run through some quick thoughts on the earlier entries before we get to the game that I played this year. First, we have Trigger Happy Havoc, which was pretty good after it hit the halfway mark. The second game, Goodbye Despair, is probably going to end up being one of my favorite games of all time. Like, fucking hell, what an improvement that thing was over the first. After that, there was the spin-off that took place in between 1 and 2, as well as being the only one that switched up genres entirely, Ultra Despair Girls. And yeah, it's a very flawed game, but honestly, I liked it a lot. Although what really drew me in were the titular Despair Girls and the character growth that they exhibited throughout. That's something the series does a very good job at. Before I could play the last game in the series, though, I had to sit through the Danganronpa 3 anime. And then I played through the last game in the series, V3 Killing Harmony. So, how was the grand finale to one of the most successful visual novel franchises of all time? Okay, I know you two have been irreplaceable throughout the years, so many years, but I'm gonna have to add another goat to the pile. As you may have noticed, I've been kind of vague with the story details with this series, and it's kind of difficult to talk about it without accidentally spoiling something. However, 3 mainline games in the series and the scenario is still the same. 16 high school students are brought into a secluded private academy and are forced to murder one another in order to escape. After a murder occurs, a trial is held to find the culprit. If they are found, they are executed. If someone else is fingered, everyone but the actual culprit gets ganked, and the actual culprit leaves the facility. This series has definitely etched its own style into the visual novel landscape, but if you want to boil it down to the core basis, it is kind of like a mix of Zero Escape's high-stress escape scenarios and Ace Attorney's investigative elements and the contradiction hunting as well. For this one, I didn't think it was going to be all that different, but the first 10 minutes immediately dispelled any worries I had about that. And by the end of the first trial, it was pretty clear that Mr. Kazutaka Kodaka, the series writer, creator, was pulling out all the stops for this one. I thought 2 did a good job with fucking with me, but this thing is on just a whole nother plane of existence. I was absolutely stricken with paranoia throughout a good majority of my playtime. It kept me on my toes, looking for any sudden left turns and all that malarkey. And ironically, that kind of made some of the twists easier to perceive. Outside the beginning, a few spots around the middle, and the ending, I wasn't really surprised by a lot of the twists that the narrative threw at me. Not to say that they were bad ones, like far from it, but I think I was just better prepared going into this one than I was going into 2. With that said, what I think these plot developments have over really anything prior in the series is that they are permeated with such great emotional resonance. And this is one series that does not lack in emotion. I'm not 100% sure if it's as compelling or even more so than what its inspirations have pulled off in the past, but it's sure giving them a run for its money. And there are plenty of other things to like here too. As per usual, it looks very nice, especially now that they weren't tied to a handheld during development. Like, the amount of color and detail can be amplified to the highest saturated pleasure possible, and it looks great. Also, as per usual, the soundtrack is absolutely impeccable. I love each and every single beat here, but I especially love the more chill-out influence songs that were included here. I think they sound like something that fucking 07 or The Orb would have made back in the 90s. It's good shit. Now, it's not a perfect game. Alongside the quibbles I had with the story that I just mentioned, I don't think the cast is as great as 2's, although it does have the best character in the goddamn series. We here stand with the luminary of the stars. May he bless us with infectious camaraderie and schmaltzy romance. However, as has always been the case, the biggest issues I have are with the gameplay. The aforementioned Ace Attorney-inspired elements, I enjoy those quite a bit, but I've never been that big a fan of the free time, especially the grind that's needed in order to really get as much out of it as you can. But those fucking minigames in those trials I have never liked, and that is still the case here. They're so unnecessary and superfluous. I just don't get why they keep putting them in here. To be fair, the new and revised mix of minigames on offer here are no longer boring and clunky. Now they're just boring. And I should clarify I'm referring to the more gamey minigames. The other ones here are just fine. And with that out of the way, as much as I didn't want to expand this discussion any further, we have to touch on that ending. I'm not going to pour over the whole thing and spoil it all for you, because it's going to take fucking forever for me to do that anyway. But I feel like discussing my own feelings on the ending is risky as is. So if you don't want to hear any of that, just skip to this timestamp. Okay, so I am fully aware of the contention that this ending has caused with the folks who have played it. And I am not surprised even in the slightest that it has become so polarizing over the years. Mostly because this is, for now, the last game in the series, so this is how it is all going to end. But I survived Zero Time Dilemma's ending, so I really didn't know what to expect here, and whoo boy. To get my one major critique of it out of the way too fucking long. This has been common throughout each game's endings. They're all way too goddamn long, but this one in particular, Jesus fucking Christ. I was up well into the night trying to finish this goddamn thing. But I think in spite of its contentious nature, I like to believe that we can agree that it is an incredibly bold move. You don't see something as risky as this in a lot of things. Perhaps I just have not seen enough movies, read enough books, played enough games, but I feel like this would still be at least a little disarming to any veteran or any longtime player or someone experienced in this shit. Because this ending recontextualizes so much of what went on during this killing game, and while a lot of people are going to find that very unsatisfying, I for one am far from dismissive about it. In fact, this is probably one of my favorite video game endings of all time. I'm not even 100% sure if I actually like it, but just experiencing it for that first time is just enough to supplant it in my memory for the rest of my goddamn life. And even then, despite how ballsy and as seemingly definitive as this ending may be, fucking Kodaka was smart enough to include quite a few inconsistencies with the narrative to the point where I'm even doubting this is even the case. It is so messy and convoluted, and just that refusal to budge from this ambiguity is so admirable. I just cannot bring myself to hate it. Even with everything surrounding it, it still carries the same gusto that the other two games' endings have, with our main cast overcoming these impossible odds. I'm gonna need another playthrough down the line to make sure that this holds up to scrutiny, but man, that's a hell of a way to make a good impression. Taking this all in, this is what puts V3 above 2 for me. It's just such an incredible experience. Overall, this is going to end up being one of my favorite games of all time, one of my favorite stories, likely, and if you disagree, that's perfectly fine. And I am very interested to see what else this man has in store in the coming years. I mean, he and Kotaro Jukoski of Zero Escape fan have already combined their powers to make World's End Club just a few months ago, and I'll be talking about that and how that went in the next video. But for now, this is where we're going to have to leave off the Danganronpa franchise, and I think it ended off with quite a bang.
Plus, the board game from Danganronpa V3 Killing Harmony has been expanded into a standalone game.
Oh god, I'm never gonna escape this series, am I? So that will do it for the first entry in what I hope will be a very fruitful series. Release schedule is going to be a little haphazard, like it is with Controversy, because it all depends on me getting enough interesting games that I have played to fill out an episode to this length. But, as I said before, we'll see how it goes. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed these crazy thoughts. And, as always, I'll see you later. Yeah, I know you're a little more straightforward, but have you ever tried anything like that in your series? I don't think so. Oh, shut up about the snail.